Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this presentation about Pennycress staging. Really appreciate the opportunity here as part of the I Prefer project, which stands for Integrating Pennycress Research, Enabling Farm and Energy Resilience. This is a new crop that's hitting the market here in the central Midwest of the United States. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a project where we've gone through the process of staging pennycress and developing a staging guide so that growers, practitioners, and teachers can refer to different stages in relation to physiological development of this crop. Again, this is a new crop that's being developed for the central Midwest. Domestication of this really started in 2010. And it's an attractive crop because it has utility in summer annual cropping systems. In general, planting this crop would happen in September or October annually, with harvest being available in late May to early June, depending on your latitude. And so it really has the ability to plug into a summer annual crop with minimal disturbance to either corn or soybeans, which are more typically planted on any given year. But as of now, because it is a new crop, the standardized staging process has been a little bit lacking. So we worked to develop a staging method adapted based on the BBCH method. So pennycress growth and development begins as a rosette after emergence, and this is established prior to dormancy. Typically, we're talking about winter pennycress. This is planted in the fall, establishes as a rosette, and then will overwinter in that state until spring, where it begins bolting. The size of the rosette in the fall typically depends on planting date, and we can see that in the picture as we move across from A, B to C, that planting date was earlier to later. And it really does affect emergence and size development with that cooler temperatures in the fall and precipitation that's available. So the rosettes will overwinter, the plant will resume growth in the spring, and from the crown, it will produce a primary stem as well as secondary stems coming off of the plant. The secondary stems from the crown are typically referred to as tillers of the plant. The tillers of the plant can also produce branches. Typically, these are related to flowering branches and will increase seed yield and seed pod development. The amount of branching may be controlled in part by planting density, in that greater densities will branch less, with lower densities branching more in our production systems. For a typical latitude of 42 degrees north, this would be kind of the upper Midwest here. Stage 0 is going to be our first stage. That's going to happen around planting, and it's going to be the germination stage. And stage 1 will be where the plants will enter into for overwintering process. Stage 3 is going to be that bolting phase that we see the plant coming out of dormancy at the end of March, early April, when we can see that start to happen. The plant will rapidly go into inflorescence or flower development, which we termed as stage 5. The seeds will continue flowering progression through stage 6. The date of first flower is typically thought of as occurring roughly 50 to 55 days before harvest will be available for that crop. The plant will go through the seed filling process, which again takes about 2 months, at which point it will reach seed maturity and then progress to harvest maturity. And we'll show some pictures of these different stages throughout the presentation today. The actual dates referred to in this timeline are typically built based on that 42 degrees latitude. If you're farther south, these stages may be happening a little bit earlier. If you're farther north of that latitude, they may end up occurring a little bit later in the growing season. But stage 2, this is kind of where you have planting and emergence. If we wanted to get really resolved, we could talk this through. Essentially, radical emergence is halfway through the germination phase. Hypocotyl elongation through the soil would be 0.7. 0.9 would be kind of the point where the plant is breaking through the soil but hasn't fully emerged yet through that emergence. Looks very similar to the hook stage in soybeans, but it's very, very small. These seeds are very small, as we can see, this smaller than the size of a penny. Stage one is where we start to build out our rosettes on the plant. This can be done in the fall for a longer period than we might expect because the base temperature for growing degree day accumulation, or the temperature that's required to be at or above for plant growth to happen for this crop, is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So we can still grow and put on leaves even if the temperatures are cool. And so the more leaves that come out of that rosette, the farther along in that stage it is, and the larger the rosette will be entering into the winter. Tillers really don't start until after stem elongation begins in the spring. That's a little bit different than we see with small grains, where we'd see the main shoot emerge and tillers start to develop in the fall. For pennycress, what we're seeing is leaves being put on, more leaf pairs unfurling, as opposed to tillering occurring. As we enter into the spring, we start to see stem elongation occur. It will begin with the main stem first, though we will see tillers start to form and begin to elongate. The substages for this stage typically are determined based on final height, and it can be difficult. But the good news for us is that as we progress through stage 3, stage 5 is going to follow fairly shortly afterward. You might notice we've jumped from stage 1 to stage 3 and then on to stage 5, and that's because in the BBCH practice, there are some stages that don't occur with this crop at this point in time, but they may occur at some point in the future. So we've elected to keep those in kind of as placeholders, but they're not really ones that we're going to be using at this point in time because those stages don't occur in the crop as we know it today. Stage 3 is also a good time for spring nitrogen fertilizer application. This is the most common fertilizer that's required at this point in time. We may get to the point where we better understand soil phosphorus and potassium removal in the grain, but right now we're still developing those fertilizer recommendations. Again, we are just learning about this newly domesticated crop. And so further investigation is needed to provide solid recommendations for managing P and K in the field rotations. Stage 5 is the inflorescence development stage. The beginning of the stage is where we can start to see these individual clusters forming, and the substage denotes the flower buds on the auxiliary stems as well, or these tillers. So those are indicated by the blue. The primary tiller has a flower bunch shown with a red arrow in these pictures. Stage 6 is the start of flowering. It shows open flowers here in panel A. And again, once we start to see the open flowers for that plant, we know we're about 50 to 55 days away from that plant being mature and potentially being able to be harvested. As those flower buds continue to pop open, we progress through this stage. Again, the decimal point kind of shows the percentage progression going through this. 50% of flowers open would be 0.5. 0.7 and 0.9 is where we start to see those flowers convert from just being flowers to having seed pods start to form in the lower flowers that have been pollinated. In stage 6, it's not uncommon for us to experience cold temperatures at night, which could affect stem growth and elongation. The common responses are kind of wavy stems and some of the lower seed heads turning a bit purple, but this really hasn't affected yield, and the plant typically is able to withstand these cold temperatures very well. Stage 7 is the start of seed fill. Most pods will contain somewhere between 10 to 14 seeds, and based on how many of these seeds are being filled, we're progressing through this growth stage. By holding up these seed pods, you can actually track progress based on how full the seed pod becomes. And stage 8 is where we start to see the plant going through the ripening process. We consider the seeds still to be growing until roughly 8.4 to 8.8, or basically the plants in the plot, 40% of them are starting to turn yellow to 80% of them turning yellow. And so this is the stage where seeds do end up achieving physiological maturity. Moisture content at maturity is approximately 40%, so it's a bit too high for harvest. And it's important not to apply a desiccant at this point because it could negatively affect seed oil profiles. This final stage, the seed ripening stage, is when we see oil content increasing a great deal for pennycress. And since we're mainly harvesting this seed for oil production, arresting that development could be detrimental to our oil yields at the end of the season. We progress this again based on percent of pods undergoing the yellowing phase. This is about 10% of the pods. The middle panel is showing about 8.3 here on the left, 8.5 in the middle, 8.9 is shown here on the right. The plants are really starting to turn yellow, but they haven't gotten their mature harvest color at this point in time. We start to see that at stage 9 maturity. At this point, the seeds have reached maturity, but they're not ready for harvest yet. We still need them to dry down and progress through this color change process to the point where they can move through a commercial combine effectively, be separated from the plant material, but we want to harvest it before those seed pods have fallen off of the plants. So with that, I'd refer you to our staging guide that's been published in Crop, Forage, and Turfgrass Management, and would like to thank the partnering institutions for helping with image collection and review of this material prior to publication. I'd also suggest, if you're planning to use this in your classroom, to consult our seed or plant staging lab that's been developed. And again, thanks for your time, your attention, and we hope you find value in this talking through of our staging of oilseed pennycress, the new emerging biofuel crop for the Midwest.